The metallic scratch of a needle settling into the grooves of a vinyl record echoed through the damp, concrete corridors of a Berlin that had long forgotten the warmth of the sun. From the cheap wooden casing of the Volkssturm, the people's radio, the triumphant brass of Richard Wagner bled into the freezing air, swelling with a manufactured glory that vibrated against the walls of cellars and air raid shelters. There, in the suffocating dark, families huddled tightly together, their breath hanging in the frigid air like ghosts. The voice of the state broadcaster cut through the static, crisp and unwavering, a blade of absolute certainty slicing through the gloom. It spoke of glorious tactical withdrawals, of enemy hordes decimated on the frozen steppes, of a final, inevitable victory preordained by destiny. But beneath the timbre of that confident voice, another sound was rising. It was not a sound that could be broadcast, nor one that could be silenced by turning a dial. It was a deep, seismic thud, a rhythmic vibration traveling through the bedrock of Europe. The distant, unrelenting roar of Soviet artillery churning the earth of the East, answered from above by the deafening drone of British and American bombers blackening the skies. The nation was trembling, its foundation cracking under the weight of an apocalypse, yet the official voice of Germany did not waver. The lie, in the twilight of an empire, is never a sudden fabrication. It is a meticulously constructed architecture, built brick by brick upon human desperation, designed to block out the suffocating sky of reality until the very end. Miles away from the shattered glass and pulverized masonry of the streets, buried deep beneath the earth in the sterilized fluorescent glow of the high command bunkers, the war existed only as an abstraction. There was no mud here. There was no metallic stench of blood pooling in the snow. No hollow stares of men freezing to death in the forests of Hurtgen or the ruins of Kurland. There was only paper. Across vast oak tables, generals in immaculately pressed uniforms, their leather boots polished to a mirror shine, leaned over sprawling topographic maps. They moved small wooden blocks and colored flags with the tips of their riding crops, pushing entire divisions across the board with a casual flick of the wrist. But the flags they moved represented ghosts. They were maneuvering phantom armies, divisions that had been hollowed out, reduced to starving remnants of men clutching rusted rifles, their ammunition spent, their boots wrapped in rags. Yet, in the sterile air of the bunker, the illusion was maintained with religious fervor. To acknowledge the absence of these armies was to invite the abyss. The generals spoke in the clinical lexicon of military strategy-elastic defense. Frontline straightening, strategic realignment, words meticulously chosen to anesthetize the truth. They drafted orders for counterattacks that would never happen, demanding the impossible from men who had already given everything. And these orders were transmitted upward, fed into a machinery of delusion that reached the very top, where the Führer, trembling and pale, clutched at these fictional victories like a drowning man grasping at foam. The deception was no longer just for the people. The high command was actively deceiving itself, trapped in a mirrored room of their own design, terrified to look out the window. But the window was shattering. On the frozen plains of the Vistula, the reality of the war was measured not in grand strategies, but in the agonizing, microscopic struggle for the next breath. The winter wind howled like a wounded animal, slicing through the threadbare coats of the infantrymen, freezing the marrow in their bones. Young men, barely out of childhood, and old men pulled from their armchairs, sat shivering in the trenches, their fingers too numb to feel the triggers of their weapons. In their pockets, they carried crumpled letters from home. Letters heavily redacted by censors, yet still whispering the unspoken horrors of the bombings. They read the propaganda leaflets dropped by their own aircraft, promising miracle weapons, the Wunderwaffen that would rain fire upon their enemies and turn the tide in a single day. They wanted to believe. The human mind, pushed to the absolute limits of exhaustion and terror, will cling to any narrative that offers salvation. They looked to the gray, unforgiving sky, waiting for the jet fighters and the rockets that the radio promised. But the sky remained empty, save for the endless swarms of Soviet Sturmoviks that hunted them relentlessly. When the armored behemoths of the Red Army finally crested the horizon, the earth shaking beneath their treads, the German soldiers did not see a tactical withdrawal. They saw the end of the world. They fought not for the fatherland, not for the triumphant speeches echoing from Berlin, but for the man shivering next to them, for the desperate, primal urge to survive one more hour. The grand illusion constructed by the high command dissolved upon contact with the freezing mud, leaving only the raw, unvarnished tragedy of men dying for a lie they no longer believed but could not escape. Back in the cities, the grand deception required a different kind of theater, as the Allied bombing campaigns turned Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin into towering infernos of phosphorus and ash. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment worked feverishly to paint the destruction as a test of the Aryan spirit. The streets were choked with the smell of roasted timber and pulverized brick, a thick, choking dust that settled on the skin and in the lungs, coating the survivors in a uniform gray. Women with hollow eyes and ash-streaked faces swept the rubble from their doorsteps with a mechanical, heartbreaking diligence, trying to maintain a semblance of order in a world that had lost all logic. On the jagged remnants of standing walls, vibrant posters still clung to the brick, depicting square-jawed soldiers gazing heroically into a bright future. Victory or Bolshevism, the posters screamed. The disconnect between the brightly colored propaganda and the monochromatic landscape of ruins was a cognitive dissonance so profound it bordered on madness. The radio continued its relentless broadcast, pumping out triumphant marches and defiant speeches between the wailing of the air raid sirens. But the citizens were learning to read the silences. They learned to decipher the euphemisms. A heroic defense meant the city had fallen. A shortening of the front meant a catastrophic retreat. The lie was becoming transparent, fragile as spun glass, yet no one dared to shatter it aloud. To speak the truth was treason. To doubt was defeatism, punishable by a swift execution at the hands of the SS who roamed the burning streets looking for anyone whose faith seemed to waver. Fear became the glue that held the crumbling facade together. The people of Germany were trapped in a psychological hostage situation, forced to nod in agreement as their executioners assured them that the house was not on fire, even as the flames licked at their boots. As the spring of 1945 approached, the skies over Berlin took on a sickly, bruised purple hue, illuminated by the constant flashes of artillery on the Silo Heights. The war had finally come home. The distant thunder was no longer distant. It was a physical force that rattled the teacups in the cupboards and cracked the plaster on the walls. The illusion of distance, the barrier that the High Command had so carefully maintained between the front and the homeland, collapsed entirely. The Soviet artillery, massed in unimaginable numbers, unleashed a barrage so dense it seemed to tear the very fabric of the atmosphere. Inside the fort bunker, 50 feet below the Chancellery Garden, the air grew stale, heavy with the smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the bitter almond scent of cyanide capsules carried in brass casings. The maps on the tables were no longer sprawling depictions of continents. They were desperate, claustrophobic sketches of city blocks, subway tunnels, and bridges. Yet, even as the Red Army fought its way through the suburbs, block by bloody block, the theater of the absurd continued. The dictator, his left hand trembling uncontrollably, his eyes glassy with a cocktail of narcotics and despair, stared at the map and ordered the phantom army of General Steiner to launch a massive counterattack. He moved his trembling finger across the paper, tracing a path of salvation that existed nowhere outside his deteriorating mind. The generals in the room, men who had commanded millions, stood in paralyzed silence. They looked at the map, they looked at their leader, and they looked at each other. They knew Steiner had no army. They knew the troops assigned to the attack were a motley collection of exhausted stragglers, wounded men, and terrified children of the Hitler Youth, armed with Panzerfausts. They barely knew how to fire, but no one spoke. The habit of obedience, the paralyzing fear of the tyrant, and the sheer momentum of the grand lie sealed their lips. They nodded, clicked their heels, and sent the orders into the void. Above ground, the consequences of this silence were measured in oceans of blood. Because the High Command refused to capitulate, refused to admit that the war was lost, the city was turned into an abattoir. Old men with World War I medals pinned to their civilian coats, and boys barely 12 years old in oversized uniforms, were shoved into the rubble, told to hold the line against the most battle-hardened army on earth. They fought fiercely, driven by a toxic mixture of fanaticism, fear of the Soviets, and the desperate, lingering hope that the radio was telling the truth, that a miracle was coming. They died by the thousands in the choked, dust-filled streets, their bodies crushed beneath the treads of T-34 tanks, their blood staining the cobblestones red. They died in the flooded subway tunnels, in the burning basements, in the shattered ruins of the Reichstag. They died because the men in the bunker below could not bear the psychological weight of surrender, preferring to pull the entire nation down into the grave with them. The ultimate betrayal was not a military failure, it was a moral void. The leaders had demanded total sacrifice from their people, but when the time came to face the consequences of their own monstrous hubris, they chose to hide behind the bodies of their children, wrapping their cowardice in the flag of an imaginary victory. Finally, the radio fell silent. The broadcast towers were captured or destroyed, the power grid failed, and the relentless stream of propaganda that had drowned out reality for 12 years was abruptly severed. The silence that followed was not peaceful, it was heavy, suffocating, and terrifying. It was the silence of a truth so absolute, so devastating, that it required no words. The bunker, the epicenter of the grand delusion, consumed itself in smoke and flames, its architects escaping justice through the cowardice of suicide. When the guns finally stopped firing, when the thick, black smoke began to clear, revealing a shattered lunar landscape where a magnificent city had once stood, the survivors emerged from the earth. They climbed out of their cellars, their faces coated in white dust, looking like ghosts wandering through a graveyard. They looked at the smoldering ruins of their homes, the twisted metal, the bodies piled indiscriminately in the craters. There were no phantom armies to save them. There were no miracle weapons. There was only the cold, hard, inescapable reality of their defeat. The great lie had evaporated, leaving behind a nation hollowed out, utterly destroyed by its own blind faith in the men who had promised them the world. Snow began to fall, soft and silent, mixing with the ash that drifted from the burning timbers. It fell on the shattered statues of Prussian kings, on the rusted husks of destroyed tanks, and on the frozen faces of the young boys who had died defending a ghost. It covered the destruction with a temporary, blinding whiteness, a shroud for a civilization that had consumed itself. The silence of the ruined city was absolute, a profound and heavy stillness that swallowed the echoes of a 12-year nightmare. It was a silence that demanded introspection, a permanent monument to the devastating cost of illusion. For when a nation trades its truth for comfortable lies, when it allows its leaders to build a fortress of deception, the eventual collapse does not merely break the walls, it breaks the soul. And as the white snow and the gray ash settled over the graves of the millions who perished for the vanity of the High Command, the cold earth whispered a singular eternal warning.